Hello, welcome to my channel. My name is Amanda and this is Birch and Lily, my channel all about the crafty goodness that I have been up to over the past couple weeks. Today is February 8th, I think, 2021, and I have a little bit of a different video this week. I didn't work on a ton of cross-stitch stuff, and this week would normally be a cross-stitch video. So instead, I decided to do something that a lot of people have been asking me for. I'm going to basically start off a cross-stitch tutorial series, kind of just like what you need to starting, all those things. Basically, that means today's episode is going to be the start of that. I am going to show you guys all of the tools that I think are necessary to get started with cross-stitch. Very few things. It's a very simple craft to get started on, I guess is the best way I can put it. So I'm going to show you all of that, and hopefully you guys find it helpful. So before I jump on in, there are two places that you can find me on the internet. The first is on Instagram at birch.and.lily, and the second is on Ravelry at birchandlily. So I guess the best place to start is basically, what is cross-stitch? I do have a project here that I'm going to use kind of as a tool per se to teach everything. Hopefully it helps a little bit. Got my floss, got my fabric. This, I guess I should say before I get started, this piece here is A Saviour's Praise. It's a pattern by Shakespeare's Peddler that I will be using. And what is cross-stitch? Cross-stitch is basically a type of needlework. It's a counted thread embroidery, and you're making X's on fabric to create a design. It's the best way you can put it. So if I was to hold this up, I hope this will focus if I hold it close. But basically, all you're doing is making little X's to create a design. So that's cross stitch. So if you want to cross stitch, if you haven't done it before, there are very few things that you need. It's pretty easy to get a hold of everything. I will link down below a couple different websites that I usually purchase from. I purchase everything online myself. You can also find things at Hobby Lobby, Michael's, anywhere like that, but their selection is going to be a lot different. And some areas do have needlework shops. So if you are lucky enough to have a local needlework shop, that's a great place to find things as well. So the first tool that you will need is thread. You might have heard it called embroidery floss, thread, there's all sorts of names for it, but that is the first thing that you're going to need. That's what makes the X's on the project. So there are tons of different options for your floss. The one that you probably know of the most, or that most people would know of, is DMC. Most cross-stitch patterns that you will find will always have a DMC conversion, so you can always go and pick this up at your local craft store. The other option that you would have is overdyed floss. These are basically created by companies who will purchase blank skeins of DMC and color them themselves and make up their own beautiful colors. So, for example, I have right here Teal Frost, which is dyed from Weeks Dye Works, and they come in 5-yard skeins, so there's lots in there, and sometimes patterns will call for that. So it's totally up to you what you want to use. DMC overdyes. Overdyes are obviously a little bit more costly because a little bit more work goes into them. So depending on what your budget is, there's a lot of options. So with thread, before you can use it to cross stitch, you actually do not use the whole strand. So when you pull it off of a skein, it comes off in this strand here. And you can actually split this into individual threads. So every strand, if I can get this split apart, comes with 6 individual threads. So before you start stitching, you do want to split apart these threads. Usually what I will do is, actually I can show you. So usually what I will do, I will cut off a piece of thread to stitch with. So this is just a tiny little piece that I've cut, and I will pull a strand off. all you have to do to get a strand off of here is grab one individual one and pull. If you try to pull more than one off at a time, you're going to get a knot, but if you pull one strand at a time, it literally just pops right off. So, to stitch, you want to split that apart. The pattern will usually tell you how many threads you want to use to stitch the project depending on the fabric size, but I will get into that in a couple minutes, kind of on how you want to pick how many threads to stitch with what count of fabric. So, fabric. There are a couple different types of fabric that you can use to stitch, one being Aida and the other being linen, which I will kind of clump linen, even weave, all of those different names together. Aida is one thing, even weaves and linen are another. So with an Aida, you end up stitching over one thread, basically. I will insert a picture in here, but the way fabrics work, they're all woven, so everything is crossing over top of each other. So on Aida, you want to stitch over one thread to create your X. So the photo next to me will describe that a little bit better because it's very hard for me to tell in words, I guess. And with linen, you actually stitch over two threads. So again, I will have popped a photo up here to kind of explain that a little bit better. If you do have any more questions, I can try and help you out though. So definitely feel free to ask those down below. And the way count works with linen is basically every little X, linen or Aida actually, sorry, every little X on that piece of fabric is a stitch. And a count of fabric is how many of those stitches fit into an inch of that fabric. So the best way to look at that, say you are working with a 14 count Aida, that means that you can fit 14 stitches into 1 inch of that fabric. Now it gets a little bit more confusing when you're using linen because you are stitching over two threads. So if you have a 28 count linen, you can fit 14 stitches into an inch because you're stitching over two of those threads. The best way you can look at it, if you want to make it a little bit easier, the bigger the number, the smaller the stitches will be because more stitches are fitting into 1 inch. So if you had two linens, one being a 28 count linen and one being a 40 count linen, the 40 count is going to have smaller stitches because it's a bigger number. You can fit more stitches into 1 inch. So how do you go about picking a fabric? That's your next question, I'm sure. You can either go by looking at the pattern, seeing what it's calling for and going for that, or you can literally just pick whatever you want. I like stitching on 40 count linen. I can see those little X's even though they're quite tiny. My mom, for example, has a really hard time seeing the stitches and the holes on 40 count linen, so she stitches on a 16 or 18 count Aida. All depends on what your eyesight is like, what you feel like doing, totally up to you. When I started out, I did tend to go for what the pattern called for. It was easier for me, I didn't have to think, but it's totally up to you. So the next thing that you will need to get started is a tapestry needle. This is basically the tool that you use the whole time you're stitching. So that again depends on the size of fabric that you're using, the count of fabric that you're using. So I will put up a little chart here beside me, or I will type it out on the screen, something like that, kind of giving you guidelines for which needle size to use on each fabric. Needles run the same way that fabric do. Basically, the bigger the number, the smaller the needle. So generally, if you want kind of just a guide to go off of, a 14 to 16 count Aida or a 25 to 30 count linen would usually need a 24 size needle. Now, moving on to a 16 to 18 count Aida or a 32 to 36 count linen, you're probably going to want to go for a size 26 needle. And finally, for a 20 count Aida or a 30 to 50 count linen, basically anything above 30, you want to go for a size 28 needle. My favorite needles, now this isn't the size I use for 40 count, this is just a package that I had sitting on my desk over there, but my favorite type of needles are these Pat Carson needles. I find they last the longest for me. They have a gold tip and they do, like they say on the package, glide through the fabric. So I purchased a 28 count needle for my 40 count fabrics. You can get packs like this on 123stitch.com. They come with, I think, 25 needles in them. There's also obviously needles available at your local craft store. There's other options available on 123stitch. Like I said, everything's going to be linked down below, so hopefully you can find an option that works for you. So the only other tool that you will need is a pair of scissors. Very simple. You need to be able to cut your floss, so you want a pair of scissors. We're almost ready to get started. A couple other tips that you would need to know. So first of all, picking a fabric size. On every pattern, and I'm just pulling out a random one that I literally had on the floor beside me, every pattern, somewhere on it will tell you the stitch count. So right above my finger there. You can go onto 123stitch.com. I think there's other calculators available as well. You put those numbers in, the count of fabric that you want to use. So for example, I want to use 40 count, let's say, and the amount of border that you want on the project. So border, again, if I hold up the example project that I brought, the border is the extra fabric that you leave around your pattern. You need to do this. You cannot start your stitching right in the corner because you need this fabric for when you are framing your project. If you don't have extra fabric, you cannot properly frame your project. I'm holding this up backwards. That's awkward. Usually a general rule of thumb is that you want about 2 to 3 inches around the outside of your project. So if you take the calculator, you input those numbers. I will actually make sure I link the calculator itself down below so that it's easy to find. You input all those numbers, it will tell you the size of fabric that you need for your project. So very important, like I said, making sure that you have a border on it, and otherwise pick the color you want, pick the count you want. It's all up to you. So now that you have picked the count of fabric, you've got the right size, you need to know how many threads that you want to use to stitch. So like I was saying earlier, you want to split every thread into an individual thread. You don't need to do this before. I do it when I need a new color. I don't sit there and individually separate them before, but they need to be separated before you start stitching. So yeah, I don't know if that made sense, but what I'll do, say I'm ready to start stitching with this pink color, I will cut the length of thread that I want and pull off the amount of threads that I want. And then I'm ready to get started. I hope that makes more sense. So I'm going to give you another general rule of thumb here. So with a 14 to 18 count Aida or a 25 to 35 count linen, you want to use 2 strands of floss. Just for coverage, because those squares, the X's that you're going to be making, are a little bit bigger, you want to have more floss so that you get a nice even coverage and you don't see a lot of the fabric peeking through your stitches. And then an 18 to 20 count Aida or a 25 to 55 count linen, you only have to use 1 strand of your floss. Now obviously, again, with anything crafty, do what you want. If you think your 40 count linen looks good stitched with 2 strands of floss, totally up to you. You might have a harder time though pulling that thread through the fabric, so you kind of have to think of it that way. That's kind of why there's these general rules for how many strands that you should use on each count of fabric. Now, a question that I get a lot, or a mistake I see people doing a lot, is when I say stitching with 2 strands. Let me grab a needle here. Hopefully I can show this well enough. I do not have a setup to be able to film just my hands. So when I thread this, okay, so I've threaded it with 2 strands. You're not doubling it and stitching with both of these. You only want to stitch with the 2 strands. So I see a lot of people, when it says 2 strands, go like this, and then they start stitching with 4. That's going to be too thick and it's going to cause you a lot of trouble. So you want to make sure that you're only stitching with your 2, and this piece is kind of just dangling there and sliding its way through the needle as you continue to use from this bottom end of your floss thread. I never know what to call it. But yeah, that is probably the main mistake I see. Otherwise, it's so straightforward. You're making X's on fabric. There is no way that you have to do it. You can do it however you want. There are things that can be helpful for some people. Sometimes it doesn't work. I don't know. Like, I stitch different than my mom. My mom stitches different than my grandma did. Like, it's kind of whatever works for you. There are a couple things that you really don't want to do. Do not knot your floss at the back of your fabric. I will try and show in my next video, if I can figure out a way to film my hands, how you want to anchor the thread in behind. Basically, you want it held under your first couple stitches. You don't want to make a knot. I will try. In the meantime, I will find some good tutorials on how to start your thread, how to make the X's, all like that, and I will link them down below until I have a chance to possibly make a video myself, because I do want you guys to be able to get started if it takes me a while to make one of these. But yeah, I think that is about it. I've gone through the tools you need. You really only need thread, fabric, a needle, and scissors. You do not need a hoop. You do not need a Q-snap, anything like that. I stitch in hand. It's cheaper. It works just as well. Some people might like a hoop. It might make the fabric a little bit more taut for you, a little bit easier, but I literally just stitch in my hand like this and it works just fine. So I personally do not think that you need a hoop, but it's totally up to you. Otherwise, yeah, that's all you need. It's very easy to get started. It's just the biggest challenge I found was picking a pattern and deciding what the heck I wanted to do. So yeah, I think that's about it. If you do, like I said, have any questions, please ask me down below. I will do my best to help you. If I can't answer it myself, I will try and find you a video to answer your question, because I want everyone to be able to do this if they're interested. It's so much fun and I love it, and I want to share that passion and that joy with everyone else. And yeah, I think that is about all I have written down in my notes. I was just reading over them. So if you liked this video, if it was helpful to you, please subscribe and press the little thumbs up button. Give me a like. That helps a lot for my channel. It gets my video out to a bunch of other people. You can also ring the bell if you want notifications every time I upload a video. I upload every Tuesday at 10 a.m. Eastern Time. I alternate between videos about cross-stitch and knitting. And yeah, thank you again so much for joining me. I really appreciate it, and I will see you guys next week. Bye.